He tore the cloth, and it came away with a sound like dry bark splitting after rain. And beneath it, the skin was a ruined map, a lattice of burns and puckered seams. And at the center, a symbol he knew as surely as he knew the curve of his own hands. The iron-sharp outline of a double-bar spur. The brand that had once smoked on the flank of every calf he'd hauled out of the washes, the mark of his lost spread and his lost life. The brand he'd sworn would never touch anything human. His breath failed, his knees turned to sawdust, and the cabin floor rose toward him in a slow, tilting slide. He reached for the table and missed, and the coffee tin rang out against the boards, rolling and rattling, and still the symbol burned through his vision. He had put that brand in the fire with his own hands years ago and hammered it into the dirt like a grave marker. And yet here it was, right where a person's soul would lean against a wall if it could. Before we begin this journey, if stories like this find you, subscribe to Sagebrush Stories, hit the bell, and leave a comment when something in the dust speaks your name. Your support keeps these rides alive. The cloth lay limp over his boot. The woman clutched the coat he'd wrapped around her, the coat that smelled of mesquite smoke and old leather. She didn't make a sound. Her gaze wasn't on him or on the iron ghost that had crawled out of his past and written itself onto her back. Her eyes were fixed on the little square window, on the thin winter light that drizzled through the glass and painted a pale beam across the floorboards. The light trembled on the boards because his hands were trembling. And that was when he knew he wasn't just looking at a battered stranger. He was looking at the sum of something he'd done, or failed to stop, or turned away from when the wind had been colder and his heart meaner. Arizona territory, late in a year that had carried more dust than rain. He'd been living up in those bony hills long enough that the grass recognized his boots. A cabin wedged into a fold of rock, a scatter of corral rails grayed into the color of old bones, a mule with one ear folded like a letter he'd never read. He had come up there to grow quiet, and he had succeeded almost all the way. A man can forget the taste of his own voice if he tries hard enough. He had tried. He had come as far as a person can go from the noise of towns and still find a place to sleep out of the wind. The last time he'd measured a year by anything other than the shift of shadow on the floor, he had been a different man, with more cattle and a woman whose laugh grew wild out on the flats and halted when the fever did what bullets and bar fights never could. After that, there had been sales and debts and ashes. He had watched his brand go into the iron barrel, and the iron go red and then black again. He had hammered it flat and thrown it into a ravine and told himself that was the end of it. The day he found her had been like any other day, except that every day holds in it the hinge a life swings on, and a person can't see the hinge until after. He had gone down the slope for water. The arroyo had coughed up a shallow trough the last hard rain, and he was setting stones there, making a lip to catch whatever the sky might be willing to spare. He felt the air dip. The desert does that before something steps out of it. There had been the soft rasp of bare feet on sand, then a darker movement at the edge of the cottonwoods where the wash took its slow bend. She had come in out of the hard light like a scrap of fog that had lost its mountain. A curtain wrapped around her, the kind of cheap white cloth a mercantile sells by the yard to boys looking to lie about a wedding. The cloth was not white anymore. Her hair was tangled the way riverweed tangles on the snag of a submerged root. She kept one hand on the cloth and the other out ahead of her as if she could feel her way through air. He had known a kind of fear he hadn't felt since the valley where the regiment had dissolved in smoke. Not of her, of what she meant. He had moved toward her with the same slow care he used when a calf went to thrashing, not because she was an animal, but because panic has the same language in every kind of body. Her lips were split, and the black of them looked like it had been drawn with a charcoal stick. He had wrapped the coat around her, and the coat had swallowed her whole. He had lifted her, and she weighed less than his guilt. The wind had tilted the cottonwoods and set their leaves to whispering. He had listened and heard nothing in them he recognized as mercy. In the cabin he set her on the cot and set water to heat because he knew the sound of a kettle can sometimes make the world feel like it intends to continue. He kept his eyes on her hands because the tilt of a person's hands tells stories no mouth ever will. Her hands were not pleading, they were guarding something. The cloth, yes, but also the part of herself that had not turned into a quiet shadow to escape pain. The brand had waited until he had thought the worst over. It is the particular cruelty of some days that they save the sharpest point for the end. He had hoped to wash dirt from wounds he assumed were simple in their cruelty. He had hoped to lay clean bandage on torn flesh and make broth and sit in a chair while somebody not him tried to breathe without it hurting. He had asked for nothing more than that. He had gotten the brand with his dead life stamped in the middle of it. He carried wood in with his hands shaking. The stove answered with its old iron breath, expanding and popping the way it always had, uninterested in human dramas. He worked because work is the first medicine. He cut strips from a flour sack and boiled them and laid them out to dry on the table, the steam rising and fogging the window and making the desert beyond look like a far place in a child's dream. He scalded a needle and set it in a cup, not because he meant to sew anything, but because sometimes a show of readiness will convince a person's fear to stand down. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out, and when she lifted her head, it was like watching a sapling try to stand back up after a windstorm. She drank, her throat worked, and the sound of it was as loud as a thunderclap in the silence of that cabin. He thought of the night the fever stole the woman whose hair still sometimes blew across his face in sleep. He thought of the last steer he'd pushed by himself across a dry creek bed, the animal watching him with a kind of patient insult. He thought of the ravine where he'd thrown the brand. He thought of the men who had worked his place before the drought, the boys and the old ones with white lines at the corners of their eyes from squinting into sun, and how he had treated them with a fairness that it surprised even him. The brand had not come to her by accident. Iron doesn't invent itself. Somewhere between his old life and the present hour stood men who were not careful with the edges of their souls. He could feel the line of them, like a long splinter under the skin of the country. Night came with that quickness the hills know. The last smear of daylight broke on the western rim like a pottery bowl dropped on stone, and the shards fell away one by one until there was only the first hard star. He listened for hooves. He listened for the special silence that means a human being is holding still just outside a door. The only sound was the wind shouldering at the shutters and the stove ticking to itself. He slept in the chair with the shotgun laid where his hand could find it in the dark without his eyes needing to work. The memory of iron and steam and the stink of hair burned away never left the room. It reached into him and jerked at old knots. When the war had ended, he had sworn that the part of himself that had learned to turn from another person's pain would be buried with his uniform. It turned out the dirt had been shallow. Morning in those hills smells of old tin and dust that has not decided to rise yet. He rose, set coffee to what passed for a boil, and stepped outside. The slope held its breath, the way land does when it knows it has to give something up today and isn't sure what. The mule looked at him like the mule always looked, with a patient contempt reserved for creatures who make choices. Down the draw, a jay flashed blue and shrieked, then shut its mouth as if it had remembered a promise. He checked tracks along the wash where the damp sand keeps secrets for a little while. The tracks told him that her steps had not wandered. She had come straight. That meant someone had pointed her, or chased her, or both. He had a friend down in the flats who wore a badge, a man with whom he had once shared a trench and a prayer when the dirt itself had sprayed up under the first volley. They had spoken fewer than a dozen words in as many years, and none of them had been about anything that mattered. But there are chords that do not cut. He sat at the little table and took the pencil stub from the can and pushed it across a scrap of paper that had been folded and unfolded enough to remember the fold lines. He wrote a name, then another, and the word branding, not as anyone means it for cattle. He did not write his own brand. He did not write that it was carved into a person. He wrote trouble and hills and come quiet and alone. He thought about any rider who might happen along the trail that passed 2 ridges over, and whether that rider would deliver a note if paid with gratitude instead of coin. He realized he would not trust a rider, not this morning. He left the note and the names in the pocket of his coat and then put the coat back on and buttoned it as if that would keep the world's knives out. She rose, like a person who has done it too many times after being knocked down. There was a stillness to her that had nothing to do with fear. He had seen it once in a boy who had sat all night beside a horse that could not rise and somehow understood that one's heart can break in increments smaller than breath. She reached for the cup again. He handed it to her and looked away because sometimes the smallest decencies are more naked than skin. Her hair fell forward and he thought of brushes and combs and other soft implements he'd let rot. Then he thought of heat and iron, and the men who had taken a thing meant for calves and made it a language for cruelty.
The hours that followed were work and not work. You can fill a day with half-tasks when you are waiting for the sound you dread. He scrubbed the pan he had already scrubbed. He sharpened the knife he had sharpened until its edge had more shine than metal. He checked the hinges of the shutter twice. He parted the curtains with 2 fingers and counted nothing for count's sake. He tried to think of who still rode under that double-bar spur. He had sold what was left of his stock after the fever and the drought, and the first of the debts had turned wheat paper into iron, and the men who had bought had not been men he wished to see again. It was possible they had taken the leftover tools, the odd iron, the brand itself. It was possible someone had fished it out of the ravine. It was possible the desert had given up the iron in a flash flood and delivered it to a set of hands that did not bother to ask whether a thing had been taught to do harm. Anything is possible on land that remembers every footprint but forgives none. By mid-afternoon, the wind picked up and slid grit through the chinks like the cabin had learned to breathe dust. He stood in the doorway and the light fell across the yard in a slab that made the pale of the cottonwood trunks glow like bones under skin. He heard it then, the particular steady beat of hooves that doesn't match the rhythm of ranch work or neighborly travel. There is a cadence to men who believe they are riding towards something they own. It announces itself before the men do. He stepped down into the yard and let the door ease nearly shut behind him. He did not have to look back to know she was standing just out of sight, just off to the left, where the interior shadow deepens, holding breath the way a person holds a new idea they are not sure they can keep. 3 riders made the bend above the wash and came into view along the cut. Their horses were the kind that stop often, the kind whose eyes keep flicking to see if their riders mean what they think they mean. The men wore vests slick with old sweat and hats pulled low not against sun, but against what other men might read there. On the lead man's saddle horn hung a length of chain too clean for real work. They reined up without whooping or waving and without the little nod men give when they come to a place where they intend to be men. That told more than words would have. He watched their hands. Their hands moved only enough to signal to the horses to stand. He did not step down off his porch with the shotgun raised. He let the gun hang. The desert will show you exactly how much you care to live if you force it. He had learned to count breaths. He counted now. The lead man's gaze flicked past him toward the door and then back, like a tongue touching a broken tooth. The wind shifted and brought the sour tang of lamp oil and iron and a smell like rope left too long in a damp place. He could feel the trail on them, feel the town dust stuck to boot edges overlaid by rock dust not born of honest quarry, but of holes men dig in secret and fill not with ore, but with noise. They wheeled away without words. Dust climbed after them and then fell like tired snow. He waited a long while, counting insects and heartbeats, and then went back inside. And the room felt smaller, and the light felt dirtier, and the stove felt like a mouth that had burned its tongue. He cleaned the gun because that's what men do when there is nothing else to clean. He wrote again on the scrap, and this time he folded it and tucked it into the crack behind the shelf board where the wood doesn't sit flush, thinking of old cachets and the way a man will hide a thing for a version of himself who might be smarter later. By night, the peculiar quiet came. It is the quiet you find only after something mean has decided to delay itself. Coyotes sang low on the ridge and then cut themselves off as if scolded, and the mules stamped. He thought of the brand again, the way the iron leaves a bite with a raised edge that cools into a valley. He thought of a man waiting with a glove on his hand to press a thing like that into skin that does not belong to him. He thought of who had told her to run north toward these hills, because she had not wandered like someone in a fever. Someone had pointed her to him, or to a place like his. He tried to picture the face that had given her direction. He tried to picture whether that face had been kind. Dawn broke like it always breaks, quick and thin and then all at once full. He stepped out to the yard and found tracks not from the night, but old ones he had missed the first day because he had been too busy being frightened of his own hands. The tracks ran parallel to the wash down below and then cut up toward the rocks beyond, where you can hide 3 horses easy and not spook a rabbit. Watching from a distance had been part of their plan. He had been watched long before he had known he had anything to guard. The sheriff came when the sun was just past overhead, when the ground starts to radiate what it took in, and everything smells like hot steel. He did not come with tin rattling or a frown nailed to his face. He came like a man who had written long enough to come as quietly as a thought. He dismounted the way an old soldier dismounts, letting the stirrup take his weight only when the ground is sure. The star on his vest had been polished, more for habit than for show. He nodded in the way of men who have both been inside the same rain and decided not to talk about how cold it was. He looked at the door, and then at the hills, and then at the ground, and his boot scuffed at a small rock like he was listening to what the rock had done with its day. He didn't ask for coffee. He didn't ask to see her. He walked the perimeter of the yard, and then the rim above the wash, and squatted where he'd have squatted if he were someone hunting him. He wasn't the kind of law that writes citations. He was the kind that reads dust. He rose slow and came close enough to set a hand where a man puts a hand when he intends to make another person hear him without words. He put nothing there. The message held anyway. He went inside and came out again almost at once, and the briefness of it told that he had seen enough to raise his heart to his throat and choke it down again. He took a folded scrap from his breast pocket, and he took a stub of pencil, and he wrote 2 names in one place, and he let the pencil hover, and then he stowed the paper away. He had learned the hard way not to leave certain words lying around. The place he wrote was not a town. Towns have names on maps and fathers who scold boys for throwing stones at windows. The place was a sinkhole in the side of the land where men had chiseled a black mouth into the dirt and hammered home a door of deception. The sheriff had heard of it, the way a man hears of a thing from men out of breath who will not name the names but will spit to one side when they try. A mining concern that wasn't a concern. Ore carts that carried more than ore. Labor that never signed a paper. Punishment that didn't need a judge. And alongside it, a brand burnt on human skin, a brand that was not random. The sheriff touched his hat not to him, but to the air where old vows lived, and then he stepped aside and let the day think it had gotten away with something. He stayed through the next night, but not inside. He took the tree line, he took the ridge, he took the places a man takes when he means to be a wall. Men came, as men like that always come. They slouched in like normalcy wearing a wrong hat. Their horses were resigned, the way horses become when their riders teach them that words mean little. The first bullet was not a bullet in any meaningful sense. It was a warning, shouted by lead. The sheriff answered with a crack that sounded like reason. One of the horses went sideways and light came up off its flank like water. The second man reached, because reaching is a kind of sin when the moon is up and the air is thin. The door stayed mostly shut, and the woman stayed behind it. When the dust settled, because dust always settles after men pretend it won't, the riders backed away, their eyes doing the way eyes do when a word like sheriff enters the room. Law is a trick of light. Sometimes it is enough. The sheriff left when dawn came again. He left a look in the yard, the look men leave when they are telling another man that what is about to happen must happen where there are witnesses and ledgers. He left a smear of saddle soap on the gate where his hand had steadied him, because age will put a tremble in hands that does not belong to fear. He left the idea of town in the air of a place that had not wanted it. He promised nothing with his mouth and everything with his presence. He rode down slope, and the mule flicked an ear and found the sheriff wanting. The days that came were small and mighty. They were made of coffee and a broom and a dented kettle, and the question of whether a human spirit can knit itself back together without a needle. The woman learned the particular language of the cabin, where the board near the stove will always creak, where the light lays thin and warm on the table just past noon,
where you can stand to see far without anyone being able to see you seeing. She learned to sit in the doorway at dawn with the cup in her hands and let the steam turn her face into a thing that belonged to the living. She found wildflowers in a draw where water remembers itself after a storm, and came back with the stalks bent and the petals brave. He swept the porch for the first time since the fever took what it took, and when he swept, he found a coin under the third board from the step, a coin he did not remember losing. He put it back where it had been because sometimes the past needs one little anchor to keep it from drifting too close. They did not heal each other. That would have been too simple and too cruel. They healed in each other's vicinity, which is a kind of miracle this land rarely permits. He began to measure his hours not only by chores but by the small sounds of another human moving where no human had moved in too long. A cup set down. A footfall paused at the threshold, a breath that caught and then smoothed. He found his mind returning to the brand only when the sun slid low enough to turn the cottonwoods into cutouts, and then he would stand and press his palm against the doorframe and imagine wood letting him in. He could not explain why he shook when he remembered the iron. He could only shake and then stop shaking. The sheriff returned with a kind of paperwork that makes a man sweat more than heat. He set the papers on the table and weighted them with a stone because wind steals more than hats. The papers said there were now eyes on that hole in the land. The papers said there would be a riding soon, a riding with more men than are easy to argue with and more laws than any man can keep in his head. The papers did not say names. Laws written in ink are careful with names. Laws written in dust are not. In the small hours before the riding, when men who pretend not to believe in mercy sleep hardest, a different message arrived. It came in the scratch of a match that did not belong to him, and the smell of sulfur crawled into the cabin through a crack no broom can find. A shape paused at the window, and the window darkened. He did not reach for the gun. He reached for the coat on the chair back and set it over the woman where her shoulders had slipped from the blanket, because the first thing a person should protect is a person. Then he moved like the ground was a friend. He came up under the window and waited. The match burned down. The shape shifted. A whisper of oil slopped. A hand pushed the shutter, and the shutter swung. He shoved up hard, and the board of it bit the hand. The tin of oil fell, and the flame went wide for an instant and then died with a wolfish little sigh. He moved through the door like a shadow that had remembered it has a body. The yard held a man he recognized from the first day by the cut of his vest and the lazy cruelty of his wrists. The man's eyes took in the shape in the doorway and then jerked past it toward the room beyond. The brand on the woman's back had done half the work these men meant for it to do before they even arrived. It had marked not only her, but any place she would lie down. It ended not with a shot, but with a thump. The man hit the post where his skull met what wood does to skulls. He slid to his knees and then to his side, and his breath made a sound like a shoe in mud. He was not dead. He was not contrite. There are men who will go to their graves having never learned a new trick. He left blood on a post that had already seen more blood than a post needs. He left a name under his breath, a name with too many vowels in it for these parts. The sheriff took the name without taking offense at its foreignness. He tucked it behind his teeth, where names go when they are waiting to be spoken in a room where they will matter. The writing happened the next day, or 3 days later, or a week. Time got strange in those hours. The land trembled once, and then again, and he realized it was the tremble of men on horses
farther than sound, but near enough to move dirt. The mine-mouth opened its jaw and pretended to yawn. It shrugged and said it was nothing more than a place where rocks are tricked into giving up hidden things. The men who watched from the blackness behind the mouth were not the kind to trick rocks. They were the kind to trick men. The sheriff went in like law goes into any hole, carefully, loudly, hoping noise would be its own kind of shield. The men came out because men will rarely let you count them when they can count you instead. The papers that had been so heavy on the table fluttered in that hot air like tired birds. None of them changed anything in that moment. What changed things was a sound from deeper in the hole, a sound that did not belong to ore or shovels or chains. It was the soft sound a person makes when they have forgotten what breathing ought to be. It was a chorus in the way a creek is a chorus after a drought breaks. It told a story without words. He knew then the brand had been a weapon, not only against the woman in his cabin, but against many. The brand on her back had not been the only copy of that iron nightmare brought back from whatever ravine he had hoped could keep it. His hands curled. He did not remember moving. He did not remember aiming. The first man out of the blackness dropped his iron and put his hand up with a speed that told he had not expected to meet men less afraid of dying than living wrong. The second man lifted a chain like it was a shield and found out it was not. The third turned and tried to go back into dark, and the dark told him it was full. By dusk, the mouth had given up some of what it had swallowed. People came out squinting the way moles do. Scarred welts crossed shoulders, and words had been written where words do not belong. Not all were branded with the double-bar spur. Not all had marks at all. Suffering has more than one alphabet. The sheriff's face changed shape and then changed back. He was a man who knew that winning is a thing that sours fast if you look at it long enough. In the days that followed, the law turned into paperwork, and the papers turned into men clattering down a line of tents with heavy ledger books. The mine turned into a place where people lived with their eyes open. The woman moved among them, bringing water, laying a hand on a shoulder that had forgotten the weight of a hand without malice. He watched her learn her own name again each time somebody tried it out. He tried out his, too. He said it in his head like an oath and then smiled at how foolish that felt. In the evenings, the little yard felt like a place in a story he would have mocked a year ago. The mule pretended not to notice. The cottonwood shook like birds laughing in a language they had invented to keep men humble. He wanted to believe the brand on her back had been the twist the world had offered him, the last rotten tooth to pull from a mouth he had been afraid to open. He wanted to believe the rest would be mending and slow harvests and the sound of a kettle and the notion of a porch where the boards did no harm. He wanted to believe, and he almost did. The letter tore that hope with a neatness only a letter can manage. It came in the hand of a boy whose freckles had not yet learned what sun will make of them. He carried it like it was a baby bird, and when he put it in the man's palm, he did not run. He took a single step back and then looked down and found his own hands, which were shaking because the man's hands had started again, and a body will sometimes catch a tremor like a cold. The paper crackled, and he recognized the way the corner had been creased and uncreased until the fibers had tired. The first line had his name in a script that never learned to flourish. The second had a claim the desert itself rejected. It said the brand had not been taken from the ravine. It said the brand had been recast. It said there was a foundry's heat still in it. It named the foundry. It named the partner. The name was one he had not thought in years because it turned his stomach to think it. It was a name he had carved into a gatepost once and painted over after. It was a name that tied him to a kind of man he had pretended he had never been. He remembered a day before the fever when he had shaken hands in a town with clean windows and a man with gloves on had smiled with half his face and said something about capital. He had been tired. He had been willing to be comforted by numbers. He had signed a document with a quill that had stabbed his thumb and left a dot of blood like a punctuation mark.
He had forgotten the man. He had not forgotten the feeling of being relieved for a day. The letter said the man had not forgotten him. It said the man had dealt something with the money that had come out of those days, and that something was not cattle. It was iron. It was brands. It was pain for sale. He folded the letter, and he did not tear it because tearing would be a kind of mercy words do not deserve. He walked out to the porch and he set the paper down on the rail and he put a stone on it for no reason he could name. He looked at the hills, and the hills did not change shape just because his heart had. The sheriff came up the path as the old light went pale, and he took one look at the stone and the paper, and he did not reach for it. He set his hand on the rail next to it, and the two hands and the stone made a small, still life nobody would ever bother to paint. He lifted his eyes, and in them the man saw the truth he had been trying to spare himself. The partner's name lived in the lawman's eyes, too. The lawman had known and not said. He had been waiting for paper, for proof the people who ride in groups and call themselves official will respect. Proof had arrived. The sheriff's mouth made the shape of a curse and then changed into a thin line that meant readiness. The desert has no time for men stockpiling words. It wants acts. That night the woman slept for the first time without clutching the coat. The night noticed and let her. He lay awake and listened to the kettle click as it cooled. He listened to the mule chew in short, satisfied bites. He listened to his own heart go about its work with the dogged patience of a man who keeps fixing a fence nobody else sees the sense in. He thought of the partner and the foundry and the iron he had buried and the iron someone else had lifted back into flame. He thought of the way the brand had fit the curve of her shoulder blades like a hate letter made to measure. Before dawn he rose. The world was blue and unfinished. He went out to the wash and he knelt and let the cold water wake his hands. He washed them like a sinner in a book, and then laughed at himself for being that sentimental inside a skin this dust had hardened. He dried them on his shirt, and went back in and boiled coffee, and the smell of it was the smell of a day being told it had permission to begin. He laid the letter in the middle of the table, and he took the stone off it, and in that little ceremony he married himself to what had to be done. The sheriff met him at the lower trail with the way a horse shifts when it knows a rider has already decided on a thing. They rode without speaking, because the dust talks enough when hooves get to work. The foundry did not sit in town where any fool might stumble on it. It sat in a notch of land where the sun breaks late and leaves early, and its smoke had learned to crawl low and hide in the gullies. There is a particular ugliness to a building meant to hold fire when there is no reason to hold that much fire so far from men who might write down why. The slag heaps told one story, and the shapes in the yard told another. He saw at a glance that the men who worked there did not wear their own hats. Ownership is a smell. It is hard to wash off. He dismounted, and the sheriff did too, and neither bothered tying the reins because there are moments when you must trust your animal to decide for itself whether it wants to stick around. The door hung open just enough for heat to slip out like a hungry thing. He walked in and the world narrowed to bellies of metal and red mouths and shadows moving with the certainty of men who have learned to ignore their better angels. The partner's office was a square carved out of the heat with glass that had turned crooked from years of watching fire. On the glass someone had painted the name with a hand sure enough to convince fools. He felt the ground tilt under him the way it had in the cabin when the cloth fell away. He felt older than his regret. There was a book on the desk with lines in it that tried to make sense out of cruelty. There were entries with dates and numbers and initials. There were not names. Men who do this kind of work like to turn people into letters because letters weigh less when you need to carry them across a conscience. The sheriff found a second book tucked beneath the first, and that one had more truth in it. It had names. It had the name of the woman in his cabin. It had the date she had been taken and the brand she had been given. It had a column for sold and a space for delivered, and pencil strokes that had grown fainter where somebody's hand had grown tired or somebody's heart had tried to stop the hand and failed. The book had his brand drawn with a careful little flourish as if art could excuse. He closed the book, and the click of the cover sounded like a pistol being cocked in a room that had decided to go quiet. He looked up and the partner stood in the doorway of the office. No hat, no gloves now, sleeves rolled, the smile not even pretending to creep into the eyes. He had grown thicker, and his voice, when it came out of a throat that had forgotten what shame does to words. He did not wear a gun. He wore confidence. The sheriff shifted. Heat pressed on the room like a hand on a chest trying to quiet a beating that wanted to rise. He realized all at once that the iron brand had not been stolen out of a ravine by chance. It had been remade on purpose, remade to look like the one he had buried. It had been used as a signature at the bottom of a contract he had not written but had co-signed by looking away at the exact wrong moment in his life. He had given that man everything he needed years before when he chose to be saved from a debt by a handshake and a piece of paper. And a part of that man had never stopped believing he owned a piece of him, too. The partner had not come to the mine mouth with the riders because men like that do not ride. They build rooms where heat does their riding for them. He never got to decide what to do with his hands. The decision came from outside. The woman's voice reached the doorway from the yard behind the foundry, not as a plea, not as a scream, but as the kind of sound a person makes when remembering becomes an action. She had followed them. She had stood where the slag makes the ground mean and the heat lifts and wavers and lies. She had reached for the handle that sat on a forge not built for cattle, and she had dragged it hard enough to tilt a rack, and iron molds clanged and fell in a rain of cold weight, and under one of them something moved. He stepped past the partner the way a man steps past the coyote that has strayed into a kitchen. He got to the yard and saw the woman with her hands on a crate whose slats had been nailed with a type of nail they don't sell in any honest store. She had pulled one slat free and another, and her arms shook, but she did not stop because her will had found something new to hold on to. He put his fingers under the remaining slats, and he pried, and the wood gave, and inside was a pile of cloths like the one that had wrapped her, and beneath the cloths, iron stamped in shapes that were letters and numbers. They had been readying to mark more flesh, or to mark goods to ship like sugar or salt, because to men of this kind there is not much difference. He turned the topmost iron, and his breath fell out of him. It was new, sharp, the edges clean, the curves exact. It was not his old brand. It was a mirror of it, a small correction, a tiny angle changed so that a man who didn't know would call it the same, and a man who did would call it a cousin. The cousin to his brand was worse than a copy because it meant intent. It meant somebody had studied the lines of his old life the way a thief studies a window lock. The sheriff found a second iron, and under it lay a stack of papers cut to half sheets, receipts and orders, and a map of the ridges with little X marks like a boy plays at war. One X sat under the notch where his cabin tucked into stone. Another X sat over the wash where he first seen her stumble. A third sat over a long, ruined church where sometimes travelers shelter, and sometimes the wind sings one note for an hour. He felt a thing he had promised himself he would not feel again, and he did not fight it because there is a time to let the old blood move. He looked back toward the office and found it empty. The partner had moved the way a shadow moves when a cloud passes. The sheriff swore aloud this time, and he lost him nothing. They ran, and running in heat feels like dragging a wagon with your lungs. Inside the office, the book lay open where he had left it, and the chair had been knocked over, and the small safe door hung open, and a drawer had been ransacked, and the window that looked out toward the donkey track gaped. The foundry had not been built to hold a man who had decided to leave. There is a smell to pursuit that has nothing to do with sweat. The sheriff took the track not because he wanted to, but because the letters in the book turned into a command he could not bear to ignore. The woman stood in the yard with her hand still on the crate, and in her eyes a light like a new coin someone had tossed to the sun. I wanted to tell her to go back to the cabin. I wanted to tell her to leave this trouble to men whose faces were already scarred by it. I wanted to tell her a story about safety." He did not speak, because there are times when speech is an insult. He tipped his head, a gesture so small you could miss it if you were not looking right at him. She nodded, not in obedience, but in alliance. They rode after the partner into a canyon that had cracked open the land long before men had learned to talk over it. The partner knew the cut, knew where the walls lean in and make you feel small on purpose. He had left hoof marks that threw dust and laughed at it, the kind of marks that say a man believes himself chased by lesser men. The wash at the bottom of the cut was dry, and its bed had grown a skin of powder that told the truth without being asked. The partner veered once where the rock makes a false trail, and the sheriff veered too, because he had learned a trick when the faces in a different war had worn different hats. The mule back at the cabin snapped at a fly, and a flower by the window sagged and lifted again. The canyon opened into a green crease where water had found a way to work despite the odds. Trees had grown up to shade part of the path, and the shade felt like kindness you don't trust. The partner's horse stood tied to a sapling that had given up trying to be strong. Men who treat people like iron treat trees like furniture. The partner himself stood on a rock shelf above the water, where a rock face jutted at an angle that made the sky choke. He held nothing in his hands. He had a gun in the small of his back, but he was not touching it. He didn't need to. He had something better. At his feet, on that shelf, lay the thing he had gone back for through the window. It lay wrapped in a piece of canvas that had once been part of a tent where children had been kept from a rain. He kicked the bundle and it shifted, and the sound it made was the small sound you hear when you pick up a bird that isn't dead yet. He kicked it again, and the canvas slid, and the thing inside showed a corner of a plank with a mark burned into it. Not a cattle brand, not a cousin to one. It was a seal from a federal crate, the kind that come west with money and guns and the illusion of authority. Stolen military iron, stolen paper, stolen trust. He had been marking flesh with iron made for artillery, iron paid for by taxes pulled from men who thought they were buying safety. He had built a business on it. He had friends in rooms with carpets and windows that don't open. The sheriff took a step, and the partner smiled, like a man who enjoys a trick, even if it costs him a tooth. He nudged the bundle, and it slid closer to the edge of the shelf. He spoke then, and the sound of his voice bounced once off the rock and came back with more confidence. He said nothing worth writing down. Some men never do. He made the mistake men like him sometimes make. He assumed he had time to make a choice. The canyon made a new sound. It was the sound of rope under strain. It was the sound of a line gone taut. Movement at the rim. A figure in an old cavalry coat too large for the shoulders inside it. A hat brim pulled low enough to be a kind of face by itself. A rifle angled not to kill, but to interrupt. The shot sent the partner stumbling sideways, not hit, but turned into a creature that doubts its next step. The bundle slid. He lunged for it because greed is faster than fear. His boots skidded on gravel, and in that instant, all the math in the canyon changed. He pinwheeled and caught himself, and the canvas fell, and the plank clattered, and a corner of a metal box showed. The box stamped with the seal that would make men 1,000 miles away sit up straight in chairs. He snatched at it and found it heavier than a lie. His hand slipped. He looked up, not at the sheriff, not at the man in the cavalry coat, but at the third figure that had stepped out behind them when the rifle cracked. A woman in a dress that had been cleaned that morning, a coat around her shoulders that meant safety once. Hair pinned back the way a person pins it when they have decided to be strong before they've earned it. She had followed against advice she had not been given. The canyon wind took her hair and freed a lock that lifted and fell like a flag. She did not speak. She did not need to. He saw her back in his mind, saw the brand that had forced him to remember who he had been, and he saw the iron box at the partner's feet as a different kind of brand, one he could not burn out of his past. The partner went still. The sheriff shifted. The man in the cavalry coat did not move, and the angle of his jaw told a long story about old oaths and long debts. The water below the shelf glinted like coins at the bottom of a poor man's dream. Something moved in the trees at the far end of the crease, a shadow that had not been there before. More riders, or not. Riders, the shape of a wagon. The shape of ambition tethered to rope and mule. The shape of a future that had noticed them and wanted in. He took a breath to yell, and he stopped because he didn't know who he meant to warn. The partner smiled again, a tiny thing, a twitch more than a gesture. He shifted his weight to the foot nearest the edge and his hand went down toward the gun at his back. The sheriff's hand moved the way a hand moves when it has made the same movement 100 times and hated it each time. The rifle on the rim tilted just enough to call down judgment. The woman's mouth opened, not for a plea this time, not for a no, but for a word that might have been a name, or a prayer, or the name of a prayer. The rope that had been whispering through the leaves went silent. The canvas at the partner's feet bucked once like a living thing. The iron box tipped, and the seal caught the light. From somewhere behind the watcher in the cavalry coat came a second shot, not aimed at men, but at the rope, because the rope had been tied to something no one had noticed in time. Because men who know how to rig a canyon know how to use gravity the way bankers use ink. The rock shelf groaned like a door pushed past its hinge. Stone cracked. Everything held for the length of a single breath. And then the world moved. The shelf let go the way a promise lets go, without asking. Rock and man and iron slid together, a short, mean avalanche. The partner's heel caught nothing. His hand found the canvas and lost it. The box struck first, cracked the shelf again, and then took the straightest path available, down into the narrow water, with a sound like a door slamming under the earth. He didn't fall far. The sheriff's lariat, thrown blind at the first groan, bit the partner's elbow and shoulder and turned his drop into a hanging. He swung once, twice, boots kicking powder into the air like bad weather. The man on the rim in the cavalry coat leaned into the line, jaw set, the rope thrumming under him like a wire. The woman had already moved. She stepped to the edge where the shelf had been and looked past the partner to the pool. The box had gone under, rolled and lodged against a flat rock, seal flashing, lid yawning. Papers boiled up and then tried to drown. She shrugged out of the coat like a snake slips skin and climbed down the crack where roots had braided a ladder, her breath thin but steady. "Don't," the sheriff said, meaning a dozen different things. She went anyway. The partner found his balance in cruelty. He stopped flailing and started smiling. "Take your pick," he said, to no one and everyone. "Me or the box?" "Both," the man in the coat said and hauled. The partner rose, cursing, hands groping for the small gun in the small of his back like a habit he'd married. The sheriff's shot took the rock beside the gun, not the gun, and the chips stung his wrist enough to make the hand forget what it meant to do. The woman reached the pool. Cold took her breath and gave it back. Her fingers went to the box, found the lip and pried. The hinge complained and then obeyed. Inside, stamps, seals, a little book with the kind of careful columns men use when they've convinced themselves a ledger is a form of prayer. She lifted it, and water wept off the pages in silver threads. Above, the partner's boot finally found the ledge. He sucked in air to talk, the way a snake sucks in air to swallow. The sheriff didn't let him finish the word. "Enough," he said, and the rope dragged the partner past speech into effort. From the trees at the far end of the green crease, wheels showed. Wagon, 2 mules, 3 silhouettes with hats pulled like lowered blinds. The law could make a sound when it wanted. Today, it sounded like wood, leather, and men who had learned to keep their names in their mouths until ink arrived. The woman came up the root ladder with the ledger pressed to her like warmth. She put it on the rock beside the sheriff's boots and didn't look at the partner.
"Write it down," she said, voice rough, steady. "All of it, this time in names." The canyon held still for a beat, measuring the new math. Then the cavalry coat man laughed once, quiet and relieved, like somebody who'd been waiting years for a rope to hold. "Reckon that's the first order we've been glad to take," he said, and set his weight again. Up on the rim, the wind shifted. It carried the mine's old smoke away and left the creek's clean, metallic scent, the kind you only smell when iron cools in water and decides to stop pretending to be a weapon.